Hello, everyone. Welcome to the International Education Series, where we discuss the current state of education around the world in the wake of COVID-19. So this is a community conversation with the Equity and Inclusion Fellows at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, as well in collaboration with the International Education Policy at Hugsy and the Harvard's Common Space. My name is Ashley Bazin. I will be the moderator for this interactive experience. I'd also like to let the audience know to please feel free to submit your questions for today's experience. So on behalf of the entire Harvard community, I'd like to welcome Cynthia Hobbs of the Inter-American Development Bank, Dr. Faryal Khan of Unesco, and Nedgine of Untitled Chapter. So Cynthia Hobbs is a lead education specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank. She has a deep interest in improving teaching quality, and she has taught in primary schools, universities, and courses for adults. She also has conducted research on teaching practices, including intercultural bilingual math education. And prior to joining the IDB, she has worked for 15 years at the World Bank, where she also oversaw the preparation and execution of education projects in several areas, including education reform, education management, early childhood education, primary and secondary education, youth development, and transitions from school to work. Cynthia holds a degree in psychology from Bates College and a master's degree in international education from Harvard's Graduate School of Education. Dr. Faryal Khan is the cluster lead and program specialist for education at Unesco, specifically the Kingston office, covering the Caribbean cluster of English and Dutch-speaking states, specifically 20 countries. She has provided technical advice to UNESCO member states in educational reform, policy and planning in over 30 countries worldwide, and leads technical advice pertaining to sustainable development goals. Dr. Khan earned her doctorate in educational administration, planning, and social policy from Harvard University in 2005. She has 2 master's degrees in education from the University of the Punjab in 1989 and Harvard's Graduate School of Education in 1995. Dr. Khan serves at the UNESCO education sector from 1995 to 2011, specifically the Paris headquarters. And prior to joining UNESCO, she worked at the World Bank, specifically in Washington, D.C., and Beacon House School System in Pakistan. She's a board member of the McLean National Council affiliated with the Harvard University. Lastly, we have Nedgine, who is originally from Haiti and co-founder and CEO of Untitled Chapter. Nedgine has experience in the nonprofit sector with a particular focus on instructional excellence, youth empowerment, curriculum implementation, and leadership development. Her past roles at Achievement First Public Charter Schools, the Episcopal Diocese of Connecticut, World Teach, and Partners in Health has allowed her to develop and implement various leadership trainings, as well as the creation of a school principal residency program. She has conducted extensive research about the historical, cultural, and socioeconomic factors contributing to Haiti's education system. Nedgine earned her bachelor's in history from Yale College and an EDM in international education policy from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She was named among the top global social innovators by Echoing Green in 2014, among the Forbes magazine 30 Under 30 social entrepreneurs in 2016, and among the inaugural Obama Foundation Fellowship in 2018 for her work leading Untitled Chapter, a movement to equip a new generation of Haitian civic leaders for educational justice in Haiti. Welcome, ladies. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited to have this conversation with you. And I'd like to start all of us to start off on a good note. And so what are some of the highlights and unique ways your respective organizations have been able to navigate COVID-19 in the Caribbean? Anyone can start.
Would you like, I could provide an overview across the Caribbean countries, and then if our colleagues from Haiti and Jamaica could provide more country-specific inputs, would that be good?
Yes, go right ahead. Thank you.
Okay, so in the Caribbean region, hello, this is Faryal. Thank you very much, first of all, Ashley, for having us on board. It's really a pleasure to be here with the distinguished panel, and also to have this opportunity with the Harvard IEP fellows and students. So I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you. The UNESCO Institute of Statistics estimates that nearly 7 million learners are affected by COVID-19 in the Caribbean states. And in the Caribbean states, about 91,710 teachers are affected by COVID-19. So these are staggering numbers. And at UNESCO Kingston, we are taking measures on how we can best attend to the emerging educational challenges that learners and educators are facing. We are prioritizing activities that support continuity of learning, mitigate risks to learning loss, and recovery from the pandemic. So I have my colleagues Latoya and Yusette at UNESCO Kingston. They conducted a rapid assessment of educational needs and priorities in the Caribbean cluster. And based on the priorities of member states, we have 3 main pillars. The first pillar is leading policy dialogue and education partnerships for COVID-19 in the Caribbean cluster of countries to mobilize resources, advocate for, and harmonize our efforts amongst multilateral organizations, regional governance bodies, the private sector, knowledge and research community, youth, and other partners to mitigate the risks of the pandemic. In this respect, we've established a COVID-19 education task force with 20 countries. We've established a development partners group to streamline COVID-19 regional response to harmonize our efforts. And we've launched a series of webinars to support capacity building in education with a focus on distant learning and reopening of schools. We are also, our second pillar focuses on providing policy advice and technical backstopping in response to country priorities and needs. And in this respect, we are focusing in specifically on capacity of Ministries of Education for data and information management in selected countries through open MS and other monitoring mechanisms. And we are also looking at regional blended learning teacher training programs to enhance teacher capacity to the emergent requirements for distant learning and continuing professional development in inclusive policies and inclusive pedagogies. Our last pillar to wrap up is generating knowledge and mobilizing evidence to ensure the continuity of learning and minimize loss to learning, especially in areas of our comparative advantage, namely sector-wide planning, technical and vocational education and training, because we foresee an economic crisis as a result of the pandemic. And I think technical and vocational education is going to give youth alternative pathways to seek employment opportunities and entrepreneurship opportunities. And lastly, we are looking at, of course, professional development and support for teachers. So we are putting together a repository of promising practices towards the generation of a sub-regional repository for responding to emergencies in education. This is in a nutshell, and I can provide more details as we move along. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It sounds like you guys are being very proactive about this. Cynthia, how is it going in Jamaica?
Okay. Well, I should mention that I'm actually the Caribbean focal point for all of the Caribbean and live in Washington. And so some of my answers would speak specifically to Jamaica, and some are broader. So the Inter-American Development Bank actually works with all the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. So we are looking at the 150 million children that are out of school across that region. And we've really prioritized ways to help schools stay connected to children and their families. This is a time of great uncertainty, and so it's really important to learn together and share with each other. And so we've done several things in that regard. In addition to recently joining the Global Education Coalition that's led by Unesco, so we're very happy to be partnering with other organizations, because when I listen to Faryal, we're doing many of the same things, and so it's important that the agencies not be duplicating efforts but working together. So one of the first things that we did was organize sub-regional and bilateral meetings between ministries of education in the region so that they could share information and ideas and coping strategies with each other. All of them were starting to close their schools and not really sure what was happening and trying to figure out how they were going to stay connected with schools. So we organized meetings with all of the ministries in the English-speaking Caribbean and included Belize there, and then in Central America, the Andean countries, the Southern Cone, etc. And then depending on their interests and what different countries were doing, then we organized bilateral meetings to link them up with each other so that they could share with each other, because no one understands better than the ministries the kinds of issues that they're facing and possible solutions for how to deal with them. The other thing we've also done is organize a number of webinars and publish documents on social policy issues around COVID-19 related to health, education, and continuity of the teaching and learning process, impacts to the labor market, domestic violence and social protection, and specific publications on continuity of the teaching and learning process, readiness for online learning, and strategies for reopening of schools. And I can send those documents or links to them to Ashley to be shared with participants from the meeting. And we've also developed catalogs of materials and links and resources for teachers, and also for parents, because we've seen with all of this that it's not just the loss of learning, which has been tremendous, and especially for some students more than others, but also socio-emotional needs. And so resources for parents on how to accompany their children. And then finally, very specifically, based on a very long-standing relationship that we have with Sesame Workshop, we have signed a contract with them to provide content and make that available to local broadcasters across Latin America in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, and arranged for public health announcements in Dutch for Suriname. And they're on a series of episodes on different themes like music, STEM, well-being, etc. So again, I have lots more I could add, but I'll leave it there for now and then add more details later. Thank you.
That's beautiful, especially the Sesame Street collaboration. Nedgine?
Yes, thank you so much, Ashley, and thanks for the invitation to share a bit about what's happening in Haiti. On behalf of the proud UNCYET team, one of the things that we recognized even in early March, so the first cases in Haiti were confirmed on March 19th, but we knew that this wave, was starting to hit different regions at different points. And so in early March, we realized that a campaign for awareness building was really critical, because in our context, there is some stigma attached to those who might catch a certain disease or virus, especially with the unknowns and unpredictability of this virus that is COVID-19. And so as of early March and then through the last few weeks, we've been trying to raise awareness specifically about what are the symptoms, how are the ways in which transmission takes place, what are the preventative measures that teachers, parents, school leaders, and of course children can do collaboratively to make sure that we try to minimize the spread of this virus, especially in parts of rural Haiti, which is where UNCYET is working with a network of 84 rural primary schools. And so we think that the work that happens in awareness building and destigmatization is really important. The other thing that I wanted to highlight in terms of some of the responses and the initiatives that we've launched is that we've been very concerned that equity might take a backseat during these really difficult times, right? I think a lot of us all understand that this is primarily a public health crisis. But one of the things that we know, especially with the numbers that Faryal and Cynthia shared, is that there are so many learners and school institutions and just the sector of education that will be hit not just during the pandemic, but also during the aftermath of COVID-19. And so what we want to make sure we do in terms of our response is that we prioritize an equitable approach to making kids continue learning and making sure that parents and teachers and school leaders have access to what it takes to not leave anybody behind. And along those lines, we've been exploring the use of radio in Haiti, as well as interactive SMS texting. As we know, and this is not unique to Haiti, of course, We know that electricity, internet access, even the equipment that it takes to be able to be connected and online for distance learning is not equitably spread. And so we want to make sure that we're trying to use as many different mechanisms as possible so that nobody gets left behind, even unintentionally. And then the other thing too, I think Cynthia mentioned it, which has been really important for us, has been the mental health aspect of this. And so for those who are familiar with Haiti's situation, in fall of 2019, there was a lot of political unrest. And so we were just coming off of that, and then COVID hit in March. And so we are really concerned in particular about not just the physical, but also the mental health of students, parents, teachers who are grappling with the uncertainty. And so we've put together a lot of different contextually specific in Creole materials to make sure that we're using radio, word of mouth, but also spreading information about what are some symptoms that will trigger the early warning signs of maybe dealing with the mental health repercussions and the concerns that come with just having a lot of extra stress, a lot of anxiety when you just don't know what might happen in the coming months when it comes to COVID-19. And then the last thing I'll mention, I think both of the other panelists mentioned this, is the importance of having a coalition response. Unsafe YET knows that we reach about 9,000 students across our 5 partner communities, but it's not going to take our efforts alone to really combat this virus. And so we've been in touch with at least 10 other peers who are working in education in Haiti to make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel, but rather leveraging the assets that each of us brings to this fight.
Okay. Thank you so much. It sounds like you all are doing amazing work. And you all have talked about just the initiatives that you've come up with to help battle and mediate the difficulties that come with this pandemic. So I'd like you all to please expand on like the different opportunities that have come up given the pandemic, and what have you been doing? A little bit more on that, please. So Nedgine, if you'd like to start, please.
Sure. I will mention that in our approach, I know you mentioned this in the intro, that Unsafe YET is looking to build a network of civic leaders for educational justice in Haiti. And one of the challenges in the history of the education system in Haiti is that there's an artificial wall that has been built up between school and community, right? And we can go into a lot of this different historical and cultural reasons why. But we are thinking that this pandemic is a really unique opportunity to break down those walls, right? Children are at home and must continue learning. Teachers are in some ways also grappling with what are the different ways for them to build their professional development toolkit to be able to provide and serve the needs of their students. And so we are now realizing that this is a unique opportunity to really push the message that the link between home, school, and community must be really reinforced, right? There is so much, I think, at stake for us when it comes to this pandemic. And I think we should really leverage the assets that come with connecting those 3 dots. And as another example of what we're realizing is a huge opportunity here, Unsafe YET really invests in the human resources, right? The human capital of education systems in terms of the fellowship opportunities for our teacher leaders. In doing so, we realize that our teachers have a unique opportunity to share their pedagogical expertise with those in other sectors. If I can be more specific, we're realizing in Haiti that some of the information that was shared to raise awareness about the disease early on in the virus was just going over the heads of many people in our communities, right? 1, it wasn't digestible, clear, bite-sized information. 2, some of it was not in Creole, which is our mother tongue. And so there's a lot of different ways that we now know we've been equipped to deliver instructional excellence that also has a benefit to the ways in which information can be shared, whether in terms of public health campaigns, whether in terms of some of the food security efforts that are coming forward now more than ever, because as Faryal mentioned, there's going to be a lot of secondary repercussions that have to do with this pandemic in the coming weeks. So those are 2 opportunities. And I think the last one is, again, putting equity front and center. Like I really, really want to hone in on that point, that I think now people across the world are realizing that some people don't have access to the same resources as others. And I hope that this pandemic raises a spotlight even more intentionally on the ways in which we must be just as thoughtful about the response during this time of need.
Thank you. Cynthia, what are the opportunities that have come up for your organization?
Well, one of the things that we had been working on for the last 2 years was to do a very in-depth study of education management information systems across 18 countries and cities in the region, including Jamaica and Suriname. and had worked with Barbados in that regard as well. And so we had a lot of information just at the get-go regarding connectivity and what systems each of the countries had and how they worked. And so in Jamaica, for example, they actually have quite a few systems, but we had discovered that they weren't interoperable. They weren't talking to each other. And so we had already set out for each of the countries where we had worked a roadmap of what could be done to improve or strengthen their systems. And that has become a key component now in knowing where the students are, what schools they're linked to, who are the teachers, what are they studying, what kinds of internet connections or bandwidths or resources that they already have and what they would need in the future, etc. So that was the prior study was serendipitous in a way, but we had already seen it as an important measure for allowing teachers to better connect with students, and this really has accelerated all of that. The other thing that we know in our hearts, but that is difficult to do, and this has really laid it out, is that individual responses are not enough, and that we need to work more cross-sectorally. And so, you know, we often fall into that trap because we work with governments and with ministries. And so my counterpart is the Ministry of Education. My health specialist colleague talks to the Ministry of Health. Our Labor and Social Security person talks to the Ministry of Labor and Social Security. And so we often are doing things that could be much better, much more effective and more efficient if we were doing them together. And this has pushed us to think much more closely about cross-sectoral responses in health, in well-being, in labor market responses, in looking at benefits for informal workers to protect them better from everything that's happening. And also in looking at violence against women and children. And so I've been partnering with colleagues in those different divisions to look at better ways to approach these issues. And then finally, we see that the systems are very dependent on government funds all the way through, from kindergarten to grade 11 or 12, and at the University of West Indies, very dependent on consortium of governments to give them funding, and they're all going through large funding cuts, especially as more priority is being given to health-related issues at this moment in time. And so people are feeling a little panicked, but at the same time, it presents an opportunity to partner more with the private sector and respond to current needs. So for example, we saw an engineering school at University of Buenos Aires pull together and make 40,000 face masks in a week's time, or a university in Ecuador set up a hackathon to develop a 3D model of a full face mask for medical personnel. And at the IDB, we have a group called the IDB Lab, which works on innovative solutions, pulling together the private sector and the public sector. And so I think that that's also a space for more innovation and thinking about approaching things in a different way.
That is so relevant. Thank you for that. I mean, UNESCO is also, as the lead agency for education, you know, very concerned about the impact of COVID-19 on the health and well-being of the education community and learners, and especially the vulnerable populations such as the low income, the migrants, and the refugees. So there are several opportunities that have really come up because of COVID-19. The first and the biggest opportunity is this countries are really getting more connected. And this whole equity issue regarding the wide gap between how connected learners are. Because in some of our countries, only 20% to 40% of the learners right now have access to online learning. and the other 60 to 80% are really working with blended opportunities or low tech. We are passing around packages and so forth. So countries are putting in place infrastructure to enable online connectivity and resources for teachers and learners. And I think it's going to fast track the connectivity for learners who otherwise may not have had the opportunities. So right now, even though the equity is an issue, it is a big issue right now. However, I do believe it's going to fast track for the excluded groups, the possibility to be more connected in the future. So this is one opportunity that we are seeing. We are also having this opportunity to have more evidence-based policy dialogue around issues of continuity of learning and teaching, around health and well-being, like Cynthia just mentioned, the interdisciplinarity of issues, and equity, inclusion, and gender. So we are setting up knowledge platforms for policymakers and practitioners to support the identification of needs and the planning and management of the continuity of education services. So these, it's triggered off, a lot of policy dialogue and sharing of practices around these issues. In the long term, we are also looking at research and forward-looking analytical work on the implications of COVID-19 on the education sector and reforms in particular. For example, what are the implications on curriculum, teaching and practice? Teaching and learning practices are going to change now, we know that. But how can we leverage the mix of online and offline learning going forward? How can teachers and parents, collaborate to become learning facilitators? And what are the implications for learning assessments? So these questions have really come to the forefront, and we are making organizational arrangements to strengthen the multi-sectoral response, as Cynthia earlier mentioned, to education. So these are positive, unintended consequences which can be productive. Lastly, I would like to mention that UNESCO is the lead agency for SDG 4, and we put in place the global coalition. So right now, to ensure better coordination of our efforts in these challenging times, we have the Kingston office actually called, and Cynthia, you participated in that meeting through WhatsApp and through UNICEF. So
finding a way to be there.
Yes. So we are really making efforts to bring together the development partners around the table to really, put on the table what are we doing, what are our priorities to avoid duplication, to enable coordination. And I'm discovering everybody is literally doing the same thing. But we are trying to see where are the complementarities so that we build on each other's work rather than recreate the wheels again and again. So there are many opportunities that we are seeing. And I want to say lastly, but not least, one of the biggest opportunities I'm seeing is parents are really now at the forefront. And even though today parents are seeing this as a challenge and they're struggling with the teaching of their children, because they have to be at the front lines today. But I do hope this will help build the bridges between parents, community members, and the school community in the long term. Because the school is now in the home, and parents are really, they've had to dive in at the deep end and take a more active role. And I hope that in the long term, this will help build the bridges between education, community, and parents and community. This would be, for me, would be really phenomenal if this continues. The engagement, the high level of engagement of parents and communities and the private sector continues to support education. So we should not lose the momentum. We should keep it going.
Ashley, can I jump in and just add to that? Because I think that it's true that a lot of us are doing the same things. The heartening thing is that we're all concerned about the same issues. So Nedgine has put a lot of emphasis on equity issues. And we know that even before COVID, there were learning gaps between those who had more resources and more who had less. We also know that when there are prolonged gaps in contact between schools and children, that many children slide back. And so we're seeing potentially differences of anywhere from 1 to 4 years of learning gaps by the time everything gets, settled again. And we also know that probably when children go back to school, it will look very different. And there will be some children that go back and have more contact with the school face to face, and others who may do more distance learning. And so it will be important to help ministries to assess who is learning, what are they learning, how are they learning, so that those who are more able to learn with distance learning could do that, and those who need a lot more attention and support could work more face-to-face with teachers. So it gives us an opportunity to look at how students are learning and how teachers are teaching, and how we can provide more support to those students who need it.
If I may, Ashley, I just wanted to add one other thing too, because it just became, I think it was so beautifully reflected, and the expertise of Dr. Faryal and Cynthia is specifically related to the ways in which I think we have a lot to learn from a regional approach. I know that they do a lot of work with different ministries of education in different countries of the Caribbean, but I find that again and again, sometimes we skip that step and go to another continent, right? And I appreciate a lot of the peers that we have in global education in Europe and in Asia, for example, but I think that this is an interesting opportunity for us to really highlight the ways in which there might be regional solutions to the challenges that we're all confronting. So the more, of course, putting some of the language things aside, I know there's a lot of ways we can fix the language and address that challenge. I think we need to be speaking more amongst each other as Caribbean peers, because there's so many things that are similar to us in terms of history, in terms of context and socioeconomic challenge. And I hope that that momentum, just as Faryal mentioned, can continue to move forward.
Okay, thank you. That was beautiful. I definitely agree with you guys, and just building off of that and kind of touching back on what Ms. Hobbs mentioned earlier, was like everything doesn't occur in a vacuum. With receiving education, there's so many other factors that interfere with the student's ability to learn. And so my questions here is, given that, how are your organization catering to these matters that can be categorized as outside of education, but still have an influence on education? So how are you because you have issues with not only COVID, but people facing food insecurity, lack of access to healthcare, shortness in supplies, and just a slew of other difficulties. So how are you all catering to that? Ms. Cynthia, if you'd like to start.
Sure, I'll jump in. Okay, so I mean, one of the first concerns is that a lot of children rely on the school system for feeding programs and conditional cash transfers and other types of family support. And so one thing we've done is just help ministries find ways to continue offering those programs and sharing protocols from one country to another regarding preparation and delivery of food to schools or homes. As I mentioned, we've developed this catalog of tips for parents to manage socio-emotional effects of the pandemic. And Sesame Street also has put together a number of little clips on health and well-being that are included in this catalog of episodes that are available. I also mentioned working cross-sectorally with colleagues. So for a specific example, as ministries are starting to think about reopening schools, it's not just about getting the students back into the classrooms and going back to normal, because there will be a new normal, but it's even just getting the schools ready to receive the students, making sure that they're clean, making sure that there's safe drinking water. And so that requires partnering with colleagues in other sectors and in other groups. I mentioned the violence against women and children. and so we've been looking with other partners at that, both within the bank and outside the bank, with the World Bank and with UNICEF. UNICEF has set up a hotline for families, and so we're looking at how we might do messaging and then link it back to the UNICEF hotline to see the impact on the messaging and letting people know about this resource. Also labor market specialists, working with labor market specialists, and we have a program in the Caribbean, for example, that trains at-risk youth, so youth that may have been incarcerated or may have been in gangs, to teach them TVET skills. And we had a whole cohort that had just graduated and was ready to go into the labor market, and obviously that is not going to happen immediately. And so maintaining the case managers that work with them to help them work through this, try to find meaningful ways to spend their time, and giving them socio-emotional support so that they don't become discouraged and slide back into the life that they had before they'd received the training. So those are just a number of different ways that we've been working.
Thank you, Faryal. We can't hear you. Mute yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So UNESCO's response is primarily guided by, focusing on the health, safety, and well-being of learners, parents, caregivers, and teachers during this period of crisis. So this, of course, calls for working closely with the Ministries of Health, as we are looking at providing guidelines for reopening of schools. We are working with the health ministries, but also other health entities and governing bodies to assure that there are protocols that are in place for for deep cleaning, for sanitation of schools, provide social distancing when children return to schools, and also assure the mental health and well-being, the socio-emotional well-being of learners. So we are focusing on different aspects, and we are working very closely with our colleagues in UNICEF and also the World Bank in Jamaica in particular. So we have opened up our dialogues with the United Nations country teams, given the interdisciplinarity of education, and also the core role of SDG 4, which is our Sustainable Development Goal 4 on education, on other sustainable goals like poverty alleviation, peace, resilience of societies, and so forth. So we are working with our UN country teams closely. I want to just put on the table that I've been appointed to this position. It's been less than 6 weeks. So I haven't yet landed in the Caribbean, but we have opened up dialogues through, we are meeting with everybody through Zoom and Skype at the moment and trying to build those bridges. Our second interest, of course, is ensuring the right to education, especially for the most disadvantaged and excluded groups, on the basis of gender. So it's an issue, it's a question of, socioeconomic equality, and also where there are ethno-linguistic differences. And so, so we are trying to focus on providing supports to the most vulnerable groups to provide the social protection that is required at this time. And the resilience of national education systems is also critical, and this is linked with the humanitarian and development nexus. So we are working not just on the education development nexus, but also collaborating with the humanitarian nexus in terms of crisis, and we also hope to provide support during the recovery period. Another part of our analysis focuses on looking at the macroeconomic trends and the labor market trends to mitigate the impact of the economic crisis on the education system, and also to mitigate risks for youth who may be at risk, and we are using technical and vocational education and training as a pathway for enabling opportunities for alternative pathways for employability and also entrepreneurship. So this is in a nutshell, how other factors are being taken into consideration as we develop our response with member states.
Yeah, thank you both so much for sharing that. From the more grassroots point of view, just based on the work that we do in communities in Haiti, everything that was already shared is definitely applicable, right? Because I think the more we think about a systemic approach, those are the different technical data, research pieces that, and policy decisions, of course, that have to prepare us not just for today, but in the case where there's a second wave or in the case of another pandemic, right? I think that's just the reality in which we live. But the things that I would add just from our experience in Haiti, one, collective leadership matters, right? There's not going to be one entity or one organization that's taking the lead. We need to figure out the niche and the expertise that each of us can contribute to a coordinated approach. And that's the work that we've been trying to do in coalition with other education and non-education organizations in Haiti. I think the second piece that I wanted to highlight is we must follow the people, right? We must follow their lead. I think there's a lot of well-intentioned efforts that sometimes gets rolled out, and it's in the rollout you start to realize who's being left behind. And so we take a different approach at Unsafe YET. As the great activist Glenn Martin says, those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And so we've been really trying to survey our community members since early March to really figure out, if this lasts several months, what would be your first order of need? What would be your second? And it's probably no surprise to any of you, food security, clean water, money for rent, right? That comes first before they say, please give me a laptop for my child to continue learning. It's not that they're saying one is more important than the other, but we know based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's some things that should come first. And so we want to be able to serve as an ally and as a connector with those who are the experts in food security and the experts in clean water. And so we hope that we can also act as a bridge, us as educators and who are teachers who have access to the thousands of children and their families that might be out of the reach of those who are maybe in cities or urban areas and don't have frequent access to the remote areas of Haiti. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention in terms of a cross-sector and interdisciplinary approach is that there have been countries who have faced these kinds of challenges before, right? I think the more that we can do to be intentional about the ways we can learn from a country like Liberia that went through Ebola and came out on the other side. Haiti had a cholera epidemic right after the 2010 earthquake, and we got through that. I think there's a lot of things that sometimes in the moment we forget to have a historical analysis of. And so I think it's going to be interesting to figure out, even though that this situation is very different from those other cases, what would it look like for us to mobilize resources in ways that would be helpful instead of potentially making certain errors that were learned from those past experiences.
Thank you so much for that. Yes.
Thank you. I think those are such pertinent points. Thank you very much for raising them. I would like to mention that Unesco has been holding a series of webinars, and two of your points I wanted to respond, but I think now it's timely we've had educators and health specialists from Ebola on board, from Liberia. So we are looking at some of the other examples where there was the pandemic, health pandemics. We've had earlier cases. So I can actually share with all of you the links of those seminars which are recorded. So we do bring in experience from Liberia, from Ebola, and from other countries. And the other point is I wanted to just share with you in response. It's a very yes. Okay, I'll stop here for the moment, and we'll pick it up as we move along. But those are very pertinent points that you raised. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have a few questions from the audience. The first one being from Tracy Jones. Have you all thought about what might happen if there is a second wave of the pandemic this winter? If so, what are your thoughts on how educators and families can prepare for this challenge? I think, Nedgine, you touched on that. If you'd like to kick off, please.
Yes, I think one of the things that we're doing in Haiti is preparing in case this, not in case, I think we all know that this coming school year is going to be a very different school year, right? Whether or not there's a second wave to this, I think what we're trying to figure out is what would it look like for teachers to be prepared to do an entire school year with a blended approach, similar to as been brought up by a couple other panelists. And what that looks like, right, is equipping teachers differently. I think sometimes we assume that teachers are ready, right, to just implement a different approach, but there's a certain level of professional development and training that needs to come in the hands of maybe a teacher who wasn't equipped and wasn't trained in electronic, right, delivery or a laptop or a virtual delivery of content. It's a very different skill set. And so what we're trying to figure out is what would it look like to leverage the period between our school years. So in Haiti, the school year should technically end in June, even though the Ministry of Education is grappling with whether or not we can use the summer months to do some catch up. What we're looking to do is figure out what it looks like just to leverage that time to do some professional training, to make sure that the blended approach is not just an effort, but actually has efficacy, right? I think we all understand that people have the best of intentions to make learning continue to happen, but if it's not being done in a way that is high quality, there might be additional repercussions that we then have to deal with, right? And so we're trying to leverage the period to do additional professional development. That's been an important piece. And then the other piece, I think several people have already mentioned it, parents are critical here, right? And I think a lot of them have already shared with us what they would need to be able to be co-facilitators of learning and teaching along with teachers. And the ways that we've seen that be most effective is when you literally get parents, teachers, and school leaders on shared sessions. We're not creating different content for those three different groups, but how much can we have a coordinated effort that brings those three groups together? That's what we have seen to be the most effective.
Cynthia, thank you.
So I would add to that. Yes, we have thought about it, and yes, the most critical thing is to get teachers better prepared, because quite honestly, in the Latin America region, the only country that was prepared for this was Uruguay, because they have a program called CEBAL, which had already given out laptops to all of the students. The teachers had experience working with online, and so they had a definite advantage in all of this. But all of the rest of the countries are using blended approaches. And in a country like Suriname, where only 30% of the families are connected to the internet, it really relies more on television and radio and printed materials. The issue with this blended approach and with the television and the radio that we're seeing is that it is very much one-way teaching and one-way learning. So students sign on or turn on the television at a certain time and they receive the information. What we don't know is how much they're actually learning, and it's not interactive. And so, I mean, it's as interactive as it can be, but that's where there's a steep learning curve for us as well. How do we make teaching and learning more interactive using this distance learning? And as Nedgine said, we're trying to use this time in between. So in Latin America, a lot of the schools started in March and in December. So haven't started yet or have postponed their school year or are doing small things. Then there are the other countries who are closing in June and would start again in September. And so just using this time in between to try to come up with as many different strategies and to provide as much training to teachers as we can to get the system reorganized, so that if another wave comes, ministries are better prepared, teachers are better prepared, administrators are better prepared, families are better prepared. And so actually, even within our organization, we've had a lot of talk about more flexible working strategies. I personally have 3 teenagers who are pretty resistant to homeschooling, and so it has been very stressful for me, for example, to be trying to work full-time teleworking and also managing these 3 teenagers and making sure they're getting their work done and they're connected on Zoom at the right time for their check-in classes with their teachers, etc. So how to develop more flexibility for parents, for working parents as well, who have the luxury of being able to work from home online. So there are a lot of different issues. There are the families that are desperate because they don't have the income coming in, and then there are those of us who are more privileged who have work that we can do from home, but have these other stressors of working and educating at the same time.
Yeah. Dr. Khan?
Sorry. Hi, yes. I think my colleagues have shared their ideas, which I just wanted to say that not preparing not just teachers, but also families, and then Cynthia fully elaborated that. So, what has been said, and then I just want to mention that tomorrow we are having a webinar on reopening schools, and with our member states, and with the Ministries of Education and planners and chief education officers, we are looking at what are the, we are conducting risk analysis to mitigate the risks once they do open schools. And I think this was a very important question, which we are already considering, but we can then highlight it even further, that, as we are mitigating risks for reopening schools now, let us also look at some risks for, should anything reoccur, and if there's a second wave going forward. So I think this is really going to be critical for us. But I think my colleagues have said everything. So we can go to another question if you would like.
Yes, so we've touched on parent engagement earlier today. So Cassandra is asking, what has been the reception from parents and teachers receiving these resources? So I think the team, that might be for you.
Sure. Just from our point of view, the Haitian context, for those who might be unfamiliar, we have a highly privatized school system. And I say unfortunately because it doesn't truly serve the purpose of having education equity for all, right? Our system has almost 90% of schools privatized for many different historical reasons. And so when I'm speaking from the perspective of teachers, I want to be very clear that in our context, we have to be very careful that this response and receiving these resources does not take the place of a regular pay, right? Unfortunately, we have a situation in our country where while schools are closed, many of the private schools are not receiving enough revenue or income to be able to pay teachers. And so you're tacking on this responsibility. We're all in it together. We agree. Teachers should be treated as professionals, right? I think all of us on the call are in this work for that reason as well. And so I just want to be very clear that teachers are saying, yes, we're in this together. Yes, we have the motivation to pick up these new skills and do it well, as Cynthia mentioned. And please respect us enough to know that this is our source of income. Please pay us as if we were in schools, right? And so I think we need to figure out a way, and that's a systemic approach that the Ministry of Education and a coalition of schools need to come together and figure out how to treat teachers respectfully in a time when we're all dealing with the stressors and the unpredictability of this period. And then in terms of parents, one of the things that we've received as a response is same for us, right? We want to do this job well and serve as a facilitator with our students, but we also need to leave our home to be able to be surviving, right? And social distancing is really tricky in our context. And so we're trying to figure out the right ways to have a conditional cash transfer, for example, or food distribution, things that again facilitate the role that parents want to play, but sometimes do not have the privilege of choice to be able to conduct. And then I guess the last other thing we're learning from parents is they really love this idea that there might be parent leaders who have a certain level of experience and can be activated as leaders of their peers to do this well, right? Not every parent will have the same level of experience or motivation to do this, but what does it look like to equip a cohort, right, of parents in every community that needs this kind of approach, and then have that approach spread?
Yes. Thank you. I'll be taking the last question from Yudong, but Felicia specifically has a question from Cynthia. I may connect you both if to have that answered because it's about Sesame Street. However, Yudong is asking, during pandemic, did you find any topics related with education policy that you expect researchers should have studied but don't find satisfying answers? That's interesting. Thank you for that question. So any shortcomings that have come up for y'all? Cynthia?
The Sesame Street question.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine.
No, actually, she doesn't really ask about Sesame Street. She's asking, about young children and how you can reach them. And I would just do a shout out to the Early Childhood Commission in Jamaica because they've put together a COVID corner. If you go to their website, just look up, I think it's ecc.org but if you just Google Early Childhood Commission Jamaica, their website pops up, and they have a COVID corner, and they actually have materials for every age group from 0 to 5. So things for 0 to 9 months, things for 10 to 18 months, etc., that parents can do with their children, and they have daily classes, daily things, new content every day. They also have people from the Early Childhood Commission reading stories, so you can click in and see them reading storybooks. They have tips for parents, etc. I think that's exemplary. What they've done with COVID, their COVID corner, is exemplary, and I know that the Ministry of Education is working with them to provide more high quality content for that. The other question is really tricky because, you know, we tend to always base our future actions on our previous experiences, and so it's hard to say. I mean, I would say more that what this has done is highlight the things that we knew were important, like finding more equitable responses and ways to be more inclusive with education. We haven't even talked about boys, but that's a huge issue in the Caribbean. Boys underachievement, higher dropout rates, lower enrollment rates in tertiary education, etc. So and the expectation that this may lead to more dropouts or fewer boys returning back to school when schools reopen in whichever form they reopen. And so I think I don't know that there were unexpected things, but it has definitely highlighted the things that we need to focus on.
Thank you for that. We're coming to an end, so I'd like to end off on a high note. So if you all could just go around and just in this time, what are you most hopeful for? And I'd love to continue with you, Ms. Hobbs. What are you most hopeful for in this time?
So I would go back to just to the what we were discussing about families and about the importance of greater appreciation for family, the hope that we become a greater humanity, that we become better humans, that we teach and learn empathy and gratefulness with our children and with each other. And finally, very importantly, that people have a much greater appreciation for teachers and a greater understanding of the complexities of the teaching and learning process.
Yes, yes. Dr. Khan, what are you most hopeful for in this time?
Hi, sorry. I believe there's an opportunity to build back better, to be more attentive to resilience of education systems as we work with countries on, developing their education plans and responses. And then I believe we have also been able to advocate for more resources for education, and domestic and external. There are budget cuts in education that are going on, but there's also been a high interest in building coalitions to assure that the funding for education continues to be reliable and available to respond to the need. And lastly, we've also been able to have opportunities to harmonize amongst ourselves as development partners, to align our work with country priorities, because this crisis has forced us to come together around a table and work together. And last, I want to say I have hope in the youth. The youth in the Caribbean have important voices, and they can become our ambassadors to bring about an era of change and bring about solutions that are locally grown but also global in their perspective. So I think I have a lot of hopes in the youth of the Caribbean as we move forward, and their citizenship. Thank you.
Hear, hear. I want to make a lot of noises in response to what was already shared, because I totally agree with what my two colleagues already shared. The only thing I wanted to add is something that we hold very deeply as a belief at UNSAPE YET, which is that incredible teachers are incredible civic leaders, right? Teachers are the civic leaders that our society needs across all countries. And I'm just excited for the ways in which that power is being unleashed and a light is being shown on the ways in which mighty teachers are doing impact well beyond the four walls of a classroom. So thank you again for this opportunity.
Yes, thank you all for just sharing the work that you all do. You guys have definitely inspired me with the work that you do. And I hope that everyone has been able to take away something from today. With that being said, be sure to check out more upcoming events in the International Education Series. Tomorrow we'll be focusing on Asia, specifically Cambodia and the GCC. And on behalf of the Harvard community, we thank you for your insight, your leadership, and this opportunity to connect with each of you. So thank you so much and just have a beautiful day.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
Of course, thank you. Bye everyone.
Thank you very much for this. Wish we could discuss more with you all.
I agree.
Yes,
I agree.
we need another hour.
I agree.
Or two.
Thank you all. Have a beautiful
Thanks,
day.
everyone.